All right, welcome everybody. Getting the last couple people that signed up late. We got them in got them their links, and so thank you so much for coming to the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. If this is your first time, if you've been here before, thank you so much for coming again. If this is your first time, we're glad you're here. And just to give you an update on our upcoming lectures, we actually have. I missed my page. There we go. Our next one is on March 22nd, which is Monday. This is coming Monday at 6 p.m. Dave Thomas will be talking about Harold Baptiste, who started AFO Records. Harold Baptiste, yeah, but does it sound good? So that's on March 22nd. And then we have a couple more already lined up in April, one on the Louisiana Decima, and then April 27th on Luis Moral Gachok. So I guess we have kind of a music theme going for the next couple ones. So we'll probably put a couple more in there between here and then. So tonight, our speaker is Dr. Catherine Oliveris. She earned a PhD in history from Yale University in 2011 and a PhD from the University of Oxford. Before joining the Stanford faculty, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London. At Stanford, she studies 19th century America, primarily in the antebellum South, Greater Caribbean, slavery, and disease. Her research seeks to understand how the epidemic yellow fever disrupted deep Southern society, specifically in New Orleans. Her talk tonight is entitled A Lesson from History, How the Yellow Fever Epidemic Changed Society. So please welcome Catherine Oliveris.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. And I wish I could sing and I could continue this musical theme that you're having for the next couple sessions. But alas, we're going to be talking about disease instead. So I wish that we were together in person, actually. This has been such a funny year to be a historian of disease because I've seen many things that happened in the past sort of play out in real life. So indulge me for a few moments while we talk about yellow fever. And I'm going to start today with two stories. So first, come with me to the first decades of the 19th century, when the German immigrant Vincent Niti reigned as one of New Orleans' largest cotton merchants. So by 1819, Nolte's cotton factory was worth millions of dollars. It was responsible for shipping about a quarter of all the cotton that passed through New Orleans, so 4 to 8% of all US exports around the world. As historian Edward Baptist has described it, no man did more to transform the New Orleans cotton market into a global behemoth than Nolte, who in the process accumulated a level of power that, quote, few who were not absolute monarchs had ever felt before. So by the 1820s, Nolte was an internationally renowned capitalist. He had uncanny business acumen, drive, and the luck of being born white, male, in the right place into the right family. So collectively leveraging these various forms of capital, Nolte and other men like him transformed the Deep South from a French colonial backwater into the heart of America's slave and cotton kingdoms. But Nolte cherished one form of capital above all. In 1806, 3 months after his arrival in New Orleans, he was bitten by a tiny female mosquito and fell sick with yellow fever, the most terrifying disease in the Atlantic world. But unlike 50% of 19th century yellow fever victims, Nolte survived his so-called acclamation. And now what had made him sick made him strong. He possessed what I call immuno-capital, that is socially acknowledged lifelong immunity to a highly lethal virus, providing access to previously inaccessible realms of social, economic, and political power. So what did acclamation do for Nolte? Now, Nolte could leverage his existing capital, so his whiteness, his maleness, his business acumen, to acquire economic capital, cash, credit, and slaves with far more certainty. He could gamble ever greater sums of money, he could restart after frequent financial panics, and he could command the labor of increasing numbers of other people, both Black and white, free and enslaved. Confident that Nolte would not drop dead in October, banks were happier to extend him credit. He could remain in town year-round or travel safely to other tropical ports when epidemics raged. And like immune men across the Caribbean, Greater Caribbean, so in Havana or Pensacola or Cartagena, Nolte found his social position improved. He could marry advantageously, he could father multiple children, and he could rub elbows with the political elite. And he said that he could do all of these things because he had made the rational choice to survive yellow fever, having, quote, not at all felt like dying. That his acclamation was proof that God and nature had sanctioned his entrepreneurship. So though he officially became an American citizen around 1811, with immunity, this immigrant became a so-called acclimated citizen, naturalized to the Atlantic's torrid zone. So now come with me to Easter Day 1812, when the cotton planter John Palfrey was contemplating how to avoid financial ruin for the third time in a decade. Now, Palfrey had come down to New Orleans from Boston in 1803, just after the Louisiana Purchase, like many ambitious white men of his day. But he was not a very good businessman. Soon his commission house failed, as did his sugar plantation, and by 1810, he was over $10,000 in debt. So, escaping creditors, Palfrey moved west to try his hand at cotton planting. So, to purchase the plantation Forlorn Hope, which I always think is, apt for Palfrey, what a name. To purchase Forlorn Hope and 20 enslaved people, Palfrey secured a loan for $8,000 from the commission house of Beverly Chew and Richard Ralph. So, as a security for the loan, Chew and Ralph held the mortgage on the land and on the enslaved people. But it turns out that Palfrey wasn't very good at cotton planting either. And he went even further into debt. And then Chew and Ralph called in their loan and threatened to sue if he didn't pay. So like many white men in Louisiana, highly leveraged, property rich, and cash poor, Palfrey laid out his position in terms that he thought that Chew and Ralph would understand. So he would send them a bit of ginned cotton as a show of good faith, but he refused to revert any of the slaves, claiming that this would ruin him. So Chew and Ralph agreed to a compromise. They would drop their lawsuit if Palfrey sent them half his slaves to cover half his debt. Now, Palfrey grudgingly agreed to this, but then he got quite lucky because of the disruption caused by the War of 1812. So it was only in 1815 that the issue was raised again, and by then, Palfrey claimed that they needed to renegotiate the terms. Now, he argued that the 10 people should cover considerably more of his debt. So why was this? Because he claimed that these people were seasoned, as they had survived yellow fever now, quote, a circumstance which adds very considerably to their value. Now, Palfrey laid out his logic to his attorney, showing how the value of a 9-year-old girl named Maria had increased. So you can see here, I've sort of blown this up here. So this is 5% per year, the risk that is being, this is the sort of the surplus being added onto the original price of Maria. Now, Palfrey insisted that he should be compensated for the risk that he had adopted in taking on unacclimated property, as the, quote, risk was mine and has cost me loss and expense and a great deal of trouble and anxiety, end quote. So for white men in Louisiana like Palfrey, who would shortly lose 2 white sons to yellow fever, Black people's acclamation was a risk reducible to a numerical value, and it was his prerogative to leverage it for his gain. We do not know what Maria or any of the other enslaved people that Palfrey owned thought about this speculation. It must have been horrible to know that even sickness and suffering and immunity could be so coldly monetized. Indeed, acclamation increased Maria's value to her white owner, becoming just one more matter for speculation in the debt and credit markets underwriting the Cotton Kingdom. Okay, so one bite from the wrong mosquito put Vincent Niti and Maria on 2 very different paths. While their bodies' immune responses to the yellow fever virus were identical, this society responded to their acclamations differently, using racialized assumptions about epidemiology to justify more inequality. Now, historians of Atlantic empires and slavery have long considered New Orleans as an outlier among American cities, characterized by its sort of Caribbean-esque tripartite social system of whites, free Blacks, and slaves. But there was another rigid, if invisible, hierarchy at work. Orleanians were either yellow fever survivors, so-called acclimated citizens, in a probationary period awaiting their acclimation, so unacclimated strangers, or they were dead. Now, no deep Southerner could avoid a brush with yellow fever. Cases appeared every summer, but every 2 or 3 years, it reached epidemic proportions, upending society as thousands died or fled in panic. And overall, the virus killed about 8% of New Orleans inhabitants and left countless more widowed, orphaned, and bereaved. Now, living amid this lethal virus was, and ubiquitous death was terrifying. But here's the twist. So unlike in other American cities where yellow fever occasionally struck, so Charleston or Philadelphia or New York, in New Orleans, a white person would not necessarily want to avoid yellow fever. Here, the necessities and temptations of business, so wealth through cotton, sugar, and enslaved people, made risking death and gaining immunity to yellow fever indispensable for white people wishing to gain wealth, prestige, and power. So tonight, I will show how disease immunity evolved into an explanatory tool for success or failure in this version of capitalism, and a justification for a race and ethnicity-based social hierarchy in which certain people were decidedly less equal than others. Now, immunity to yellow fever, ill understood in the 19th century, was euphemized with phrases like acclamation or seasoning or creolization. Now, acclamation meant surviving yellow fever, but to have immuno-capital, Orleanians had to convince others of their immunity. Now, immunity was and is an objective biological reality. But before vaccination or diagnostic blood testing, it was invisible and impossible to verify. And unlike smallpox or syphilis, yellow fever does not leave physical scars. Not everyone exhibited the telltale symptom of black vomit. And moreover, leading physicians did not agree that yellow fever was a discrete illness, and they frequently confused it with malaria. So yellow fever immunity was thus subjective and performative, a matter of faith as much as fact. But in a city where people routinely classified others based on physical appearance, as a quadroon or as a griff or as an Irishman or as a bozal, Orleanians were socialized to recognize immunity cues in others. So if a man was Creole or had lived in the tropics for multiple years, society generally gave him the benefit of the doubt. He could pass as immune. If he was a newcomer, if he was poor, if he was foreign born or was a drunk, he was assumed to be unacclimated until proven otherwise. Now, immunity, whether real or imagined, really mattered. For the 500,000 white people who willingly immigrated here before the Civil War, it affected where they worked, what they earned, where they lived, and with whom they dealt. It decisively impacted a person's ability to find stability, social acceptance, and a political voice. And considering all the impediments faced by the unacclimated, even Dr. E.H. Barton, Edward Hall Barton, who was the president of the Board of Health in 1841, he suggested that, quote, the value of acclimation is worth the risk. Now, most white newcomers quickly heeded this wisdom, not avoiding but actively seeking illness as a pathway to profits and respectability. As one Connecticut immigrant boasted while convalescent, quote, victory had perched upon my banner. I was an acclimated citizen and as such received into full favor in the good city of New Orleans, where they distrust everybody until they become endorsed by yellow fever. But victory through acclamation was reserved for whites only. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were marched into this disease space and forced to confront this forbidding disease environment. But pro-slavery theorists argued that all Black people, no matter where they were from, were naturally resistant to yellow fever, and that this immunity was a sign from God that they should be relegated permanently to slavery. Now, many pro-slavery theorists argued that racial slavery was natural, even humanitarian, because it distanced whites from diseased labor and spaces that would kill them. Okay, so I'll explain how we get to this point now. So, what did 19th century deep Southerners actually know about yellow fever? Well, not a whole lot. There was no cure. There was no inoculation. There was no conclusive evidence of disease transmission. There was no satisfactory evidence for why it killed some while leaving others healthy. And it was only at the very end of the 19th century that yellow fever's vector, the female Aedes aegypti mosquito, was discovered by Cuban researchers, by which point yellow fever had already killed approximately 150,000 people in New Orleans and as many as 250,000 across the Gulf South. And it was a miserable way to die. Yellow fever victims experienced a sudden onset of intense headaches and muscle pains and jaundice, nausea and chills. And within days, they oozed blood through their external orifices and vomited up partly coagulated blood, which was roughly the consistency and color of coffee grounds. Eventually, patients lapsed into a coma and then died. And it was so painful that even pious victims screamed profanities as the end neared. Now, the luckiest people contracted sort of milder flu-like cases in childhood. But overall, 19th century victims had around a 50% chance of dying from yellow fever. Now, heeding the prevailing concepts of disease communicability, most antebellum physicians argued that yellow fever, unlike smallpox or syphilis, was non-contagious, as it did not spread directly from human to human. Rather, yellow fever was miasmatic, the organic result of the city's heat and filth. Now, contemporaries called yellow fever a stranger's disease, strongly associating it with recent white immigrants from the North and from Europe, especially poor ones. And you can see here, this is just a page from the interments at Lafayette Cemetery, and you can see the cause of death here is yellow fever, yellow fever, yellow fever. And this is the origin, where born. And this is, a page, this says Germany, and many other pages, there'll be just tons of Irish people listed one after the other. Now, essentially every record shows that yellow fever was incredibly deadly for foreigners. So while as many as 8 Orleanians per 100 died annually, making it America's deadliest city by far, deaths could reach 20% in certain immigrant neighborhoods. Now, of the 60,000 Germans who entered New Orleans between 1848 and 1858 and took up permanent residence in New Orleans, for example, about half died from yellow fever and cholera. And in 1853, the year of New Orleans' worst epidemic, about 12,000 people died, constituting 1/10 of the city's population, but 1/5 of the Irish-born. Now, in total mortality terms, the 1853 epidemic remains one of the worst natural disasters in American history. Now, one life insurance company singled out Irishmen as 57 times more likely to die from yellow fever than native-born Louisianans, and Dutchmen and Belgians over 91 times more likely. Now, white Southerners took as axiomatic that Black people were less affected by yellow fever, but modern epidemiologists have discovered no mechanism for hereditary resistance to yellow fever, suggesting that immunity did not pass from African-born parents to American-born children, even though everyone at the time said they did. So at the time, though, almost the entire medical community publicly echoed the words of Dr. Samuel Cartwright that Black people were, quote, perfect non-conductors of yellow fever. So hereditary immunity did not exist, but contemporaries argued that it did, and they dispatched selective evidence to construe resistance in a racially specific manner. Now, statistics, of course, can only hint at how people experienced living in such a deathscape. Thousands fled upon the slightest rumor of fever. Those lacking funds or opportunity or freedom had no choice but to remain. Canal Street emptied, newspapers stopped publishing, courts and schools closed. At night, an eerie silence descended over the streets, broken only by the screams of sufferers in shuttered houses. Everybody knew somebody who had died. Survivors remained in houses that triggered memories of dead loved ones, slept in beds once shared, and dined at tables where empty chairs memorialized the departed. Now, fear-mongering and misinformation and speculation ran rampant. Newcomers grew weary, in fact, of all the contradictory tips and sort of dark stories. It was just too much, too hard to process, too numbing. And in a place where everybody was a self-professed yellow fever expert, nobody really was. Now, by the 1850s, most people understood that the only protection against yellow fever was to survive it. But what exactly was acclamation, and how could a person prove it? So if you asked a dozen people on Bourbon Street in 1850 to define acclamation, you would get probably 3 dozen different responses, maybe even more. One passerby might respond that acclamation was simply the body's year-long reconciliation to the climate and the atmosphere. Another might tell you that only surviving a serious case of yellow fever made a person acclimated. Another person, waxing poetic, might ask you to look at the picture more holistically and to consider acclamation as an initiation to the climate and the culture. A slave trader might laugh at your ignorance and tell you that acclamation was a gut feeling, an instinct that one learned through years of experience. So finding those definitions unsatisfactory, you might ask some follow-up questions, eliciting a more hostile reaction. Could a person lose their acclimation if they left the tropics? Were Creole children acclimated from birth? Did mild cases of yellow fever lead to full acclimation? Was a Cuban acclimation sufficient in New Orleans and vice versa? Hopefully, you would not commit the ultimate faux pas by challenging these men on their own acclamations. That might put you in the hospital. Now, probably, you would leave these conversations agreeing with the wisdom of novelist and steamboat captain Mark Twain, that acclamation was a highly sensitive and deeply personal topic on which, quote, no two persons exactly agreed. Now, not knowing what to believe, most Orleanians remained very nervous about whether they were truly acclimated, frantically scanning bills of mortality in July and agonizing over whether they should stay or they should go. As Elizabeth Trist, who was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, who lost both her husband and son to yellow fever, wrote, quote, I hope that my constitution has become creolized, as they term it here, having had a very substantial seasoning. Still, I can't help but be afraid as the summer approaches. Now, the difficulty of verifying acclamation, an idiosyncratic process based on precarious science and anecdotal declaration, proved a conundrum for life insurance companies seeking to extend policies only to good Southern risks, so these are acclimated white yellow fever survivors. Now, most insurers carved out this region here, class 4 or region 4, from the rest of the South, and said that while acclimated men were insurable, they would still have to pay a substantial climate premium. Now, mutuals had an incentive to put these climate premiums low enough so policies would actually sell, but they had to be high enough to counteract the risk, normally between 1% and 5%. And that may sound quite small, but it was actually a lot of money because it was on the total value of the policy. So, $67.70 for $1,000 of a whole life policy, that is a lot of money, way out of reach for many working people in New Orleans. And of course, getting an accurate answer to the question, is the party acclimated, which is a standard question on insurance forms by the late 1840s. This was basically impossible. Now, medical exams were marked by hazy memories. So policy seekers had to remember the specific year and month of their brush with yellow fever, often decades later. They had to recount all of their symptoms, and they had to produce witnesses very often, who would write signed affidavits. And the disproportionate numbers of Southern death claims, all from allegedly acclimated people, proved that many bad risks passed their medical exams. And so by the 1850s, most insurers denied all applicants from New Orleans unless the person could prove that they had lived through multiple epidemics and agreed to travel restrictions. Now, many immigrants sought acclamation sooner rather than later. Ironically, facing yellow fever was the only guaranteed way to prosper long-term, especially for young white men seeking professional advancement in cotton factories, merchant houses, and wholesaling. So jobs considered springboards to slave and land ownership. Now, delaying the inevitable by fleeing the city was expensive, and it posed long-term financial impediments, like diminished access to well-paid, steady employment. Now, moreover, in a place where risk-taking was embedded into the value system, postponing or eschewing acclamation, a very public demonstration of risk avoidance, impeded social and civic acceptance. So New Orleans' business schedule, however, made responsible acclamation essentially impossible. City authorities implored unacclimated immigrants to stay away until the first frost. But by November, all well-paid, upwardly mobile positions were already filled. And with floods of applications, about 50 per job, employers preferred bilingual or trilingual acclimated men only. So if newcomers waited, they risked languishing in social and professional purgatory for the rest of the year. Now, rents in healthy neighborhoods, convenient neighborhoods, affordable in September, were extortionate by December. So basically, most immigrants and young men who were not acclimated set up just outside of the city, frantically scanning these newspapers to determine exactly when the weather had become Octoberish. So this is just safe enough from disease for them to stage their reappearance. Now, most young men steeled themselves to follow the advice of the Picayune, which said, quote, "If a man intends to make himself a citizen of New Orleans, his first duty is to become acclimated. He owes it to himself and to society." Now, many Orleanians described acclamation like being reborn. As one newspaper declared in 1853, the acclimated man walked the streets with a, quote, "tremendously bold swagger, sneering at the unacclimated, who darted about timidly and nervously. The acclimated pooh-poohed yellow fever and called it a mere nothing." Later, Orleanians would boast of the year of their acclamation, so 1817 or 1833 or 1849, like a membership badge in a sort of invisible fraternity of disease survivors. Some would even celebrate their acclamations like an anniversary with a yearly feast. Now, this was so important to acclamation that I've seen examples of young men quite literally injecting black vomit into their veins, seeking to get sick. I've seen examples of young men, after their friends have just been carted off to the cemetery, jump into their bed, roll around in their sheets, hoping that they would also get sick. So this is how important it was that people were willing to do such things. Now, seeking to capitalize on their hard-earned immunity, job seekers filled newspapers with personal declarations of acclamation. So one clerk enumerated his credentials in this order: well acclimated, well educated, speaking 5 languages, with the best of references, notable integrity, and business capacities. One middle-aged man claimed that he was, quote, well acquainted with the city and also well acclimated between the latitudes of 32 degrees and the tropics. Now, employers often demanded parental residency, proof of local birth, or else a physician's letter certifying acclamation. Now, references were considered useless unless provided by a formerly tropically based employer, because from the boss's perspective, it was a waste of resources to train someone for a detail-oriented job only to see him stricken or dead by the autumn. Now, as the unemployed German immigrant Gustav Dressel lamented in the 1830s, quote, "I looked around in vain for a position as a bookkeeper, but to engage a young man who is not acclimated would be a bad speculation." Now, amid the fatal churn, acclimated men could parlay immunity into raises and greater responsibility, with the managerial classes of merchant houses and wholesalers and groceries composed almost entirely of white men claiming immunity. But even after rigorous acclimation screening, employees still died in droves. As one traveler noted after the epidemic of 1836, quote, "5 perished out of one counting house. Another house buried their bookkeeper, employed another, buried him, and employed a third before the dead season had passed." Now, such mortality among the allegedly immune suggests that clerks either misjudged their immunity or they willfully lied about it. Now, that was a high-risk lie. False declarations of immunity, acclamation, merited termination, basically an unimpeachable sign of untrustworthiness. But many apparently believed that the lie was worth it. They would feign ignorance and then worry about surviving the disease later. Now, In time, declaring acclamation did more than assuage employees' fears. It became a catch-all statement of character. So a successful brush with yellow fever became the sort of quintessential demonstration of calculated risk-taking in this marketplace, that a white man had willingly gambled his life and had paid his biological dues. And all the elites factored successful acclamations into their genesis stories. So though he could have fled in the summer of 1801, for example, the 18-year-old Irish immigrant Monsell White remained, realizing, quote, "Alas, there was no help for it but to take my chance." Now, reminiscing decades later, White recalled his acclamation as a major life turning point. So with only an informal education, he progressed quickly from bookkeeping to running his own cotton factory, to sugar planting, to politicking. And now all of this he attributed partly to his acclamation. Now, like Nolte and all the most powerful white men in New Orleans, Monsell White framed his acclamation as a choice. So he had decided to contract yellow fever and had willed himself to survive. Now, in this logic, lesser men literally chose to die because they were drunkards, or they were effeminate, or they were sexually deviant, or they were cowardly or unpatriotic or unclean, or because they did not seek timely medical care. Now, distilling the randomness of life and death to a matter of individual choice fed into the sort of myth of meritocracy, that all whites of sufficient moral and physical courage had the potential for survival and success in New Orleans, that economic and social success was the direct result of a man's willingness to take controlled epidemiological risk. Never mind that this sunny vision of yellow fever clashed with a very fatal reality. So the cold facts of disease risk, that half of all victims would die, mattered little. The myth of immunological reward proved far more powerful. Thus, while epidemics raged, young men then, in fact, just as they do these days, routinely touted aspirational mantras about human agency over disease, insisting that yellow fever was a mild ailment and reassuring families that they had never enjoyed better health. Now, such optimism may have been self-delusional, but most unacclimated migrants bought into Immuno-capital and the hierarchy that it created, believing that the system would benefit them eventually. After all, immunological discrimination was just one more form of bias in a city essentially premised on inequality. Now, the logic, of course, of this could easily slip into abuses. Recruited directly off the boat, thousands of Irishmen built the new Basin Canal in the 1830s, working in ghastly conditions. So between 6,000 and 10,000 Irishmen died of yellow fever while digging the 4-mile stretch of the new Basin Canal. Now, the bosses actually preferred a labor model that focused on replacing the dead rather than keeping people alive because high turnover cost them nothing. It also impeded laborers' ability to organize and demand better pay, conditions, or rights. Now, the immunity calculus insinuated itself into all relationships. So emphatically, Orleanians argued that men could not fulfill their patriarchal duties to their wives and children until they became acclimated. As one editorialist argued, quote, "We conjure all the interesting young gentlemen to become acclimated as soon as possible, for they ought to recollect how cruel it is to visit among Creoles or families acclimated before they are so themselves." Now, old-timers warned their daughters against, quote, linking their faith with that of an unacclimated lover. So not only was this beau more likely to die, but unacclimated men were generally poorer and less established than their acclimated counterparts. So sincerely, the Picayune insisted, "We are opposed to the existence of any strong ties until acclimation has taken place." Now, immunity was also important for white women on the marriage market. As one writer proclaimed, quote, "The acclimated girl is a treasure, and though she may not have yellow hair, if she has had the yellow fever, she is worth a mint of money." Now, men screamed their potential wives for acclamation, asking questions like, "Miss, have you ever had the yellow fever? Was it a typical case? Are you certain your physician was correct in his diagnosis?" Now, shifting gears ever so slightly, Immuno-capital shaped life in New Orleans through a cycle of mutually reinforcing realities specific to the climate, the industries of New Orleans, demographics, and the political culture of the city. So in an era where state and municipal governments across the US were mounting increasingly muscular responses to disease, public health could scarcely have been worse in New Orleans. Now, New Orleans had no competent institutions tasked with tracking or defining disease. Boards of health came and went. Unpaved streets stank with stagnant water, night soil, and rotting animals. Quarantines buckled under pressure from the business community. And outside of the Ursuline Nunnery or the Charity Hospital, the city had very few places for poor victims of disease to receive care. Now, even in the larger Southern context, New Orleans invested significantly less money into ameliorating disease-related problems than other cities. So in 1850, for example, New Orleans spent just 4 cents per person per year on public health, compared with 69 cents in Boston. Now, most Orleanians resigned themselves to the fact that their government took essentially no action to combat yellow fever, even though, as one reformer suggested, the death rate was at least double what it ought to be. Now, whether defeated by disease or defiantly deaf to their constituents' needs, most politicians, in fact, came to embrace the philosophy that the only effective long-term solution for epidemic yellow fever was not public health, but paradoxically, more yellow fever. Expensive water pumps and quarantines only delayed the inevitable process of having to get acclimated. In fact, pursuing solutions to yellow fever was considered a poor use of political capital, and there were essentially no negative consequences for politicians who avoided the disease question. So historian John Satcher estimated in 1820 that property requirements barred 57.8% of white men from voting in New Orleans. Now, excluding so many white men while also excluding women and free Black people and enslaved people and children and recent immigrants meant that only a small portion of city residents held politicians accountable. And luckily for politicians, those inhabitants who clamored for public health infrastructure quieted over time as they accepted the filthiness of the urban condition or gained immunity, fled, or died. And as naturalization required 5 years of residence, there was a strong overlap between the non-acclimated, the non-propertied, and the non-citizen. So figuring that a large percentage would die before becoming enfranchised, politicians found the unacclimated an easy block to ignore, because after all, dead men did not vote, acclimated men did. Now, demonstrating how little concern they had for their constituents, most aldermen, even those who claimed immunity, fled to their vast country plantations where they joined the business elite in playing like truant children. Baron Fontalba, who was the last colonial governor of Louisiana, related that he and a party had fled the city in 1796 because it was too melancholy. And they banned all talk of death and they started to drink. Now, the party amused themselves with jokes, with debauchery, with games, in a scene that was sort of somewhat reminiscent of Boccaccio's 10 fleeing the ravages of the Black Death. Now, political absenteeism during epidemics was the norm, and it crippled the function of government. Now, in the autumn of 1804, a season in which between 1,000 and 1,500 people died, 7 meetings of the city council were canceled because fewer than 6 aldermen showed up, the simple majority needed for a quorum. And in 1853, the year of the city's worst epidemic, with about 12,000 deaths, politicians fled before passing any kind of appropriation bill for public health. Now, yellow fever factored heavily into election scheduling. So in 1812, the Creole or Louisiana-born majority in the state legislature set elections for July to lessen American-born influence, precisely because Americans were more likely to flee during July than Creoles. And in another form of seasonal gerrymandering, one Democrat argued in 1845 that state elections should be moved from June to September, when unacclimated people were most likely to have fled town or else too sick or scared to vote. So Bernard Marigny submitted that, quote, "No good citizen was afraid of yellow fever. Rather, acclamation was the baptism of citizenship, offering a guarantee of devotion to the country." Now, with politicians' intent to avoid or exploit the yellow fever problem, private citizens stepped in to ameliorate mass mortality's worst social effects. Now, New Orleans was internationally famous for its charity, and with its safety net constructed and financed almost entirely by private and professional associations, by foreign consulates, and by the Catholic Church. Now, the largest contributions, however, came from elite businessmen, men who claimed that they had personal experience with yellow fever. So upon his death in 1824, Julian Poydras, a Saint-Domingue native and a pious Catholic, he bequeathed over $100,000 to charity, most of it given to yellow fever orphans. Now, private philanthropy, altruistic though it could be, was not a sufficient replacement for government support, and it made individuals like Poydras into gatekeepers, the ultimate authorities on who was deserving and who could access welfare and on what terms. And in their version, this was mostly young girls and decidedly not their filthy immigrant parents, so-called. Now, the potent combination of rampant disease and government inaction compounded society's asymmetrical status quo. So the acclimated elite gained extra social capital through these sort of honorific displays of charity. Meanwhile, the unacclimated poor came to rely on this privatized network, sort of patchwork system of charity for their survival. And most people quickly accepted the harsh reality that public health was private acclamation. Now, theoretically, immuno-capital could have transected race, but if immunity helped transform whites into potential slave owners, merchants, and commodity capitalists, Black people's alleged natural resistance to yellow fever, slavers argued, made them better, even inevitable slaves. Now, physicians and sextons repeatedly emphasized the lower death rate of Black people from yellow fever, suggesting, for instance, that only 3 Black people died from yellow fever in New Orleans in 1849, compared with 766 whites. Now, such anecdata was employed to further the social ends of white supremacy. So Josiah Nott, a doctor who claimed to have cared for more yellow fever patients than any man in America, I don't know how he determined that, but Nott posited that, quote, Negro blood is an antidote against yellow fever, for the smallest admixture of it with the white will protect against this disease. So rather than follow this argument to its next logical step, that interracial mixing saved lives, pro-slavery theorists doubled down on the utility of strict racial purity. Now, pro-slavery theorist Samuel Cartwright asserted that the Deep South's climate, quote, scorns the aristocracy of the white skin. Nature, he argued, quote, has issued her fiat that here at least whites shall not be the hewers of wood or drawers of water under pain of 3/4 of their number being cut off. Now, Cartwright here indirectly captured the twisted logic of immuno-capital. So for white people, living here was a high-risk gamble with potentially vast rewards. But for Black people, racial slavery was a scientific destiny, as their alleged immunological superiority perfectly adapted them to hard labor under the tropical sun. Now, Cartwright's theories trickled down, and they got a lot weirder. So in 1853, the Weekly Delta, a newspaper, argued that as divine punishment, Black people lost their natural resistance to yellow fever in freedom, and therefore that slavery was the condition best suited to Black people. And another article maintained that the only people who died from yellow fever were practitioners of abolition theory. Now, this thinking was nothing short of alchemy, of course. And despite the pious professions about enslaved people's natural immunity, no self-respecting white enslaver would purchase a person without an express guarantee of acclamation. So like fancy or likely or choice. Acclimated was a common descriptor in slave advertisements, a euphemism that conveniently reduced a person's suffering to a marketable asset. Now, acclimated slaves commanded higher prices, between 25 and 50% more. Now, like everything else in the slave market, acclamation status was a guess, but a white person's ability to judge it was considered a sign of mastery, of cunning, of intelligence, that a white man could read another person's body and discern its maximum value. Now, slave traders compensated for disease risk in their business models. As with all commodities and goods, the pace and schedule of the city's slave industry was controlled by yellow fever. Now, in 1830, only 2.6% of the annual slave sales took place between July and October, the fever season, to lessen the already considerable risks associated with moving people south. Now, enslaved people, of course, probably did not see their immunity as an asset or a capitalist calculation in the same way that whites did. Petrified of yellow fever like everybody else, slaves could not flee or afford expensive doctors independently. And in fact, many slaves from Virginia and Kentucky remembered that they feared being sold downriver, away from their families to Louisiana precisely because of yellow fever. And if immunity could save their lives and constitute a key aspect of an enslaved person's personal self-worth and identity, it added nothing to their personal wealth or standing. So as enslaved people were embodied capital, acclamation only enhanced the value and safety of that capital for their white owners. Now, by the 1820s, many slave owners considered New Orleans too risky for their expensive enslaved property. So even if an enslaved person was declared acclimated, fraud was common, as traders routinely fabricated backstories to enhance a person's value and hasten a sale. And with thousands of poor, famine-fleeing Irishmen pouring onto the levee by the 1840s, the labor calculus shifted. Now, the proportion of enslaved people in the city dropped from about 50% in 1806 to 25% in 1840 to just 8% by 1860. So capitalist needs pushed acclimated slaves into surrounding plantations, safer, less diseased, and more efficient sites for Black people to create more capital for whites. So to conclude, for white people, surviving yellow fever was classed as an indication of moral superiority. As one Orleanian congratulated his convalescent friend, quote, he had finally succeeded in getting out his naturalization papers. He is now in every respect a citizen of New Orleans, and long may he live to enjoy the glorious privilege. Now, those whites at the top of New Orleans' economic and political life, so all allegedly survivors of yellow fever, obtained a sort of de facto moral legitimacy, a tropical, if ecumenical twist on Max Weber's aristocracy of the elect. So in their public willingness to roll the epidemiological dice and risk their lives, they had been endowed with both a practical and moral right to thrive in slave racial capitalism, what they classified as a harsh but essentially honest meritocracy. And they, of course, colluded to invert this logic for Black people who were denied the benefits of immuno-capital, and with their immunity emphasizing their statelessness, movability, and malleability, at once sub and superhuman, and capable of living in freedom. Now, equating survival of yellow fever with morality justified the exploitation of unacclimated people, equating survival with morality justified the exploitation of unacclimated whites and all Black people. And it also made New Orleans a miserable place to live for the majority of its inhabitants. Now, Carl Cohn, who was an 18-year-old cotton clerk from Bohemia, he summed up the foul mood engulfing the city during the 1833 epidemic in a letter to his uncle in Paris. Quote, "Is this the dear Orleans of which you talked about in your letters with such affection? Is this the place where you now wish to lie your now mortal remains? It is only a place to die, but not to live." Now, Cohn did not leave. Instead, he faced down yellow fever and survived. And Cohn became one of New Orleans' most prominent businessmen, forming his own brokerage firm in 1842, serving as a bank president, and marrying an acclimated woman named Clara, who was the daughter of Monsell White, another yellow fever survivor and slave owner. Now, in September of 1833, Cohn had expected yellow fever to, quote, "attack with as much certainty as a condemned criminal does expect the sentence of his execution." But by year's end, after surviving yellow fever, he cheerfully described his improving business prospects and planned for the future. Now, once a source of misery and anxiety, yellow fever had now endowed Cohn with a future, transforming this one-time skeptic of America's necropolis into a bona fide titan of it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was so good. If you have questions, please get them in the chat. We've got a couple in the chat, so I'm going to get started with that. Wow, I learned a lot there. What would number?
I know I'm a fast talker. You know, you gotta really.
It was absolutely fine. No, I don't think I've ever heard a more detailed explanation there. That was really, really good. The first one is, were the number of orphanages in New Orleans predominantly because of yellow fever?
A good question, and actually one that's kind of hard to tell exactly. So yes, basically, there were more orphans in New Orleans than there were in other American cities per capita. And many of these, by the 1840s and 50s, there are specific yellow fever orphanages too, that were sort of set up, especially to deal with young orphan girls. And there was kind of a panic actually in the 1850s in the newspapers and in culture where many people became convinced or scared that these young girls who were orphaned, and to be orphaned at this time, actually, you didn't have to have two dead parents. You could have just one. And sometimes if it was a father, they would put you, if you had a surviving father, they would sort of put you into this orphanage for some time while they figured out how to sort of support themselves, or, remarried or something. But in the 1850s, there was a sort of moral panic that many young orphan girls were being sexually assaulted because they'd been left on the streets. And so these orphanages we see a sort of a real growth in the sort of these specific homes for the orphans of yellow fever. And that is also true in Natchez as well, actually, where you see by the 1850s, quite a few, 3 or 4, I think, sort of discrete orphanages popping up around that time. So it's, certainly, yellow fever very much contributed to the increasing orphan population and the sort of different institutions that would lead to their care.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, this question is from Yvette Rubio. She it addresses a later date. In 1887, her great uncle was hired to be a sugar weigher at a plantation. He claimed he was required to go to a camp for 2 weeks before starting that job because there was a yellow fever outbreak in the city and state. Do you know if this requirement actually existed?
Well, first of all, please get in contact with me by email because I'm finishing my last chapter right now of my book, and this would be really, really interesting.
There's even more about the story, but with a gun in Angola and everything like that. So I can put you in touch with her.
Please do. Fascinating. So it's interesting. So before the Civil War, there were a part of the slave trading industry. I've seen this in the slave trade, where before the Civil War, if you were going to be sold in New Orleans by the 1850s, many slave traders maintained a kind of like camp outside of New Orleans, where enslaved people, before they were sold in New Orleans, would be there for a couple of weeks or about a month, and this was expressly designed to so that they could be advertised at least as acclimated, and to increase their price. It's whether or not they actually survived yellow fever there is another question. I've seen this also towards the end of the 19th century. I've seen examples of mostly people who were involved in sort of shipping and working on the levee, that you had to supply a certificate where you declared your acclamation, or where you went into sort of self-quarantine for a couple of weeks before you took certain kinds of jobs. But I've never seen a sort of requirement that you go, you sort of have to get acclimated by 1887. That's fascinating. I'll be thinking about this at 3 a.m. tonight when I wake up, worried about COVID or yellow fever, insert disease, whatever it is. But that's really fascinating.
Okay. Well, good. Let's see. Suzanne Stone says the Jewish Home for Widows and Orphans was started after a yellow fever epidemic. Judah Toro funded it.
Yeah.
Okay, Stacy Anderson says, were the major outbreaks of yellow fever tied with new development pushing into the wetlands around the city, or were they independent of that?
So that is a great question. So the contemporary beliefs at the time held that anytime that the soil was disrupted, this is what they sort of saw as the triggering sort of moment for a yellow fever outbreak. And in some sense it's true, and in some sense it's correct. They noticed, so they identified the pattern, if that makes sense, but they didn't quite understand the science behind it. So we see basically when all sorts of canals are being built, or when the pump house for the water system in the 1830s was being built, and sort of the ground is being disrupted, you do see outbreaks in these areas. That's mostly because people were probably densely packed as they were working, probably because there was also a lot of standing water. And this mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, it's quite a pesky little bug. It actually is. Unlike the malaria-carrying Anopheles mosquito, it doesn't really like breeding in swamps. It really likes clean water to breed. And so standing water of clean, so cisterns and canals when they were clean, et cetera, these would be sort of perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So basically, you see there are certain doctors who are trying to understand the transmissibility of yellow fever, and you can see sort of they often have this model where they write the year and any sort of infrastructural events that happened in New Orleans, and also the sort of number of deaths and whether there was an epidemic. And you can see this, so when there was a great flooding in 1816, when the levee broke and it flooded throughout the city, and it took 2 months for the city to be drained again. You see, they're sort of trying to figure out, okay, so is this connected somehow? And when the new Basin Canal was being built, you see people really wondering, okay, is this it now? Or very often, more often probably than anything else, it was very much connected with butcheries and abattoirs, and it was sort of considered to be the filth of the excrement and the offal and the blood and the bits of animals that caused these foul odors, which were miasmas that caused disease. But you can see sort of people, it's interesting to sort of watch the evolution of thought on this question, where disturbing the soil and building things and expanding into the swamps did not necessarily have to create more yellow fever, but it very often did because of other factors, which is that this sort of combination of a lot of immigrants coming who do not have any immunity. You have a hot climate, and then you have these, an explosion in the mosquito population. So the expansion of breeding grounds is really what does it. And when those three things come together, that's when you get these very serious outbreaks. So yes, it's very often they did correlate, even though it didn't necessarily cause outbreaks of yellow fever to do infrastructural work in the swamps.
Great question there. Let's see. Emily Perkins says, what was the relationship between private philanthropy, the Louisiana State Board of Health, and medical doctors in terms of those sick with yellow fever?
This is a very, very good question. And the subject of one of my book chapters, which I am currently rewriting, which is why I'll be up at 3 a.m. And thinking about this. So there's so Louisiana was the first state to adopt a state medical board, which is sort of facially, at least, progress. And they do this because of yellow fever. This is, this is one of the real benefits, and this really comes from pressure. This really comes due to pressure from other residents outside of New Orleans who say, New Orleans, the business elite, the politicians will never install a quarantine. They just never will. And so there needs to be sort of oversight. However, public health in New Orleans was still under the control of the city council. So this is this kind of strange position that we see, we sort of see ourselves in here, where, so yes, technically the Louisiana State Board of Health has power over health in Louisiana, but really health in Louisiana is dependent upon health in New Orleans. And if New Orleans, if these civil servants, city councilors and mayors won't install a quarantine, that basically means that all of these upriver cities would, also see outbreaks, all the way up, so Vicksburg, all the way up to Vicksburg, and then by 1878, all the way up to Memphis, in a huge epidemic that year across the entire South. And so it's interesting because doctors, even doctors who were on the Board of Health, and so New Orleans did have its own Board of Health. It was formed ad hoc, and it didn't have any independent financing or sort of independence from the city council. It could be dissolved whenever the city council wished it to be dissolved. And it was always dissolved after quarantine was suggested or raised. And many private doctors sat on the Board of Health. They sat on the city council. Probably the most common profession outside of sort of being a planter was in New Orleans was to be a doctor. They had a lot of political power. And this is before the Civil War. And you see them sort of, it's interesting because these men, they very much saw public, they came to New Orleans. Many of them came to New Orleans from other places because of yellow fever, because it was good business. Because, if you're a doctor, cynically speaking, what's better for business than a lot of sick people, and a lot of sick and scared people who, are willing to spend basically anything. And there's no regulation on pricing, really. Every once in a while they try to establish fee schedules, but they're routinely ignored. And it's interesting here too, and this sort of, this sort of ties into your question, but many young immigrant men who came to New Orleans, they were told to save between $50 and $100, basically, as to pay for their future medical bills. So they held on to this money, and they wouldn't buy property, they wouldn't do anything else until they had yellow fever and had spent this money. And this is a huge amount of money for unskilled laborers and for clerks and for bookkeepers. And so there's a sort of strange dissonance between the sort of State Board of Health, the City Board of Health, and these doctors who, basically, the doctors themselves, nobody knew how to stop yellow fever in these times. And it's unfair for me to be so cynical about this. But you see this very often where a surefire way to, develop the capital to invest in a plantation was to go into the medical business. And Christian Miltenberger, for example, who was a doctor, who was later a city councilor, and later was on the Board of Health. He was a planter from Saint-Domingue. He had been in Cuba. He had come to Louisiana in 1809, and he came bankrupt. And he became one of the absolute richest men in New Orleans, basically through his medical practice, which he then used to purchase 3 plantations. And his 2 sons became, on the eve of the Civil War, were basically held the controlling interest in the entire sugar industry in New Orleans in 1860. So there's a sort of doctor or physician to sort of plantation pipeline here. And so there's sort of the interest of various private groups, of civic groups, and of the State Board of Health. They'd never really quite align. They don't do so really until after the war, long after the war, in the late 1870s, when the sort of business community and doctors and politicians all kind of came to agree, essentially, that the sickly reputation of New Orleans was damaging it, and that people weren't immigrating to the same degree, and that it was hurting the economy. And so they embraced this new sort of mantra of public health is public wealth. And that only happened, it happened sort of, I would say, without vigor, but really only by the 1880s. And so I'm not even sure if I answered your question. I kind of just started talking about, all sorts of weird things. This is what happens to me. I'm sorry.
No, it was actually very interesting. It's kind of not, kind of typical to politicians and the doctors not getting along, as we see today sometimes. Okay, Sheila France, as I understand that yellow fever victims may be buried in mass graves. Were there actual mass graves, and do you know where they may be?
Yes, they were. And I don't, so actually, this is interesting. I've been working with my map maker for my book on this. I've been trying to map both all the cemeteries of New Orleans and how they changed over time and where, because as the sort of city expanded, of course, there were increasing numbers of cemeteries and also hospitals and different kinds of doctoring offices. And I'm trying to track where all these things are. And it's very hard to get a sense, a precise sense of where these mass graves were, but I've seen many references. So for example, in 1833, which was a joint cholera and yellow fever epidemic, and this was probably the worst epidemic in anybody's memory by that point. So there's this one book I've read, a travelogue written by a man from Boston who was in Oregon, and he was traveling back to Boston, and he found himself in New Orleans. He was sort of trapped there without any money, and he found himself there at the height of this epidemic. And so the way he made money was by grave digging, and he was given basically hazard pay to grave dig. And he said that he and a team of free Black and Irish trench diggers spent 3 or 4 weeks digging these huge trenches. And this was, and then they would pile them filled with 300 bodies, and they made. I've heard this referenced a lot too, where adults would be laid sort of close to each other, and then children would be sort of fit into the gaps. I've seen this reference in a lot of places. I have no idea where it actually was. I would imagine probably, in the swamps behind town at those days, which was not, just beyond Tremé, really, somewhere. But again, if anybody knows, or if anybody's heard tell of the mass grave in their backyard, please enlighten me. I would be absolutely delighted to hear any further details.
Emily Perkins, the question before said, yes, you answered it. She can't wait for your book. Okay, let's see. Did New Orleans, Robin White writes, did New Orleans musician Rudolph Matas know that the mosquito was the vector before the mosquito was accepted as the vector?
So, I believe I'm going to get this wrong, I'm sure, on the fly here. But I believe so. And so actually, so the mosquito vector was discovered and was confirmed by Cuban doctors in the late 19th century. And then the vaccine was developed then there was mosquito eradication in the 20th century. The last epidemic of yellow fever was 1905. And then there was mosquito eradication thereafter, which stopped both really malaria and yellow fever. And then the vaccine came by the 1930s. But many people said, it's interesting because it was not confirmed medically that the mosquito was the vector. But I've seen many examples of people, especially by the 1870s, 1880s, suggesting that this probably was the case. In fact, Josiah Nott, that racist doctor, pro-slavery doctor from the 1840s, he suggested this. In fact, he said, there's got to be something about these mosquitoes. This makes no sense otherwise, or we should. It's not just that they're annoying and that they're biting at me, and it means that I can't work. There's got to be some connection here. So I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised if he did sort of know without confirmation. But I would have to look that up. It's been a while since I've actually looked at his papers. But probably, I would imagine at least there was a sneaking suspicion, a strong inclination in that direction.
All right, I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you so much, Catherine. That was an amazing presentation. And thank you everybody for coming out and attending it. You'll be receiving this tomorrow so that you have 30 days to watch it. If you wanted to watch again, you missed something, you've got the opportunity again to do that. And then our next one on Harold Baptiste, the New Orleans producer, AFO Records, produce, Shunny, and Share. That is on Monday at 6 o'clock with Dave Thomas. So thank you so much for everybody for attending. And thank you, Catherine, so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great week and get vaccinated, please. Bye.
Bye.